My second treat for the advanced is an interview with Professor Lance Strate, whom you can read about in the article about American speech. Let's give it a listen. It's a wonderful interview. Hello, Professor Strate. This is Shelly calling from Vocable.
Hello.
Can you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Sure. My name is Lance Strate, and I'm a professor of communication and media studies at Fordham University.
And in communication and media studies, what is your main focus? Do you have a specialty?
Well, I actually do a lot of work in new media these days, and my theoretical orientation, if you like, or philosophical orientation, is in media ecology, which is the study of media and modes of communication, and that ranges across both typical kinds of media when you think of television and movies and the internet, but also forms of communication such as language and speech and writing and printing and even situations like the difference between, say, a classroom and a boardroom.
It seems like you run the whole spectrum, in fact, in what you specialize in.
I try to keep busy.
Now, you are quoted several times in the article from the International Business Times concerning fillers in the American language.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that you studied specifically, that you have done research on, or is it more observation from having worked so thoroughly in communications?
Well, it's actually a basic element in that would be covered in a basic course on communication as part of a unit on nonverbal communication. People tend to think of nonverbal communication as being about body language, gestures, posture, and that sort of thing. But there's actually a whole area of speech that doesn't involve words, the verbal component of communication, but things like tone of voice and rhythm in speaking and pronunciation, accents, dialect, and all of that sort of thing. And it also includes those sounds we make that are not technically considered words. And all of that together is called paralanguage. That is, it's not language, but it's related to language. And so fillers or interjections or, filled pauses, the uhs, the ahs, the right, like, okay, that we use. They're the kind of verbal punctuation marks in speech, and that is part of this area of paralanguage. It also becomes very apparent when you study media, and in fact that was the genesis of that article, was not in observing people in ordinary situations, but listening to interviews on television. And certainly it becomes very apparent, or I've noticed it a great deal, in political communication, in press conferences that public officials give, and of course in more entertainment-oriented media interviews.
And we read in the article, or what I've interpreted, is that your concerns are not so much about these fillers, but about the lack of public speaking occasions, or perhaps the change in register that public speaking has taken?
Yes, my feeling is that, first of all, fillers are normal. They are part of everyday life. Every language, in every language group, people have them, people use them.
And, and always have?
Yeah. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but there's nothing strange or dramatic about this. Obviously, when you put people on television, and, of course, on radio, you suddenly notice them in a way that when we're just talking face to face, we kind of ignore them. We tune that part out. Mm-hmm. See, I'm doing it myself. I mean, I'm prone to it, so I'm a little more sympathetic to that. But for people who do speak a lot for a living, folks like me who are teachers, it's quite common to use fillers because you have to talk for a long time, an extended kind of discourse, and to give yourself a kind of pause to think about what you're going to say next, you use a filler.
And do you think that the audience is more appreciative of having constant sound? Is that something that we do so that we don't lose attention? Or because they say silence is golden too, so it's almost a stylistic choice?
It certainly is important in a completely acoustic medium like radio, where you just can't have silence for more than even a fraction of a second without people starting to wonder, is there something wrong? On television, it's a little less important. But again, I think most people today, the other side of the coin is that people used to get training in public speaking. For example, in New York State, that used to be part of the secondary school curriculum, and that's kind of been phased out in many ways. And, the idea of eloquence was a part of the traditional curriculum going back to the medieval universities trivium and through the Renaissance and into the 19th century. Eloquence was a very important ideal, particularly for people in leadership positions that you expect, for example, someone who is going to be a public figure, part of that job description is the ability to speak well. In order to reach people, to make people understand your point of view and to influence people. And that has really dropped off the map, particularly in the second half of the 20th century now into the 21st. I think one of the great examples of this was George W. Bush, who was one of the worst-spoken presidents, perhaps the worst-spoken president that anyone can think of. And, in some ways, I think he was unfairly ridiculed and mocked for what was referred to as his Bushisms. But on the other hand, it didn't stop him from being a two-term president.
I am part of the schooling system, so it dates me a bit, from the New York State curriculum, where we did do a lot of public speaking. And one of my questions is related to that, because as a child, my parents and my teachers were very strict about eradicating from my language. And I think that when you're talking about nonverbals, the word for me almost has a higher place on the hierarchy of things that we can say than and like, because like and are not onomatopoeia. They're really words that are superfluous. So is there a hierarchy of superfluous sound over superfluous word, or what do you think about that? The like, that was what, the Zappa, Moon Unit Zappa.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, and then there's well. I so well remember Ronald Reagan, the great communicator. Once he was done with his prepared remarks and into a press conference, there was a lot of ums and ahs, and he always started with, well.
When the panic was setting in.
Yeah. But again, it's not necessarily panic, but it gives you a moment to think. So I think part of it, I wouldn't call it a hierarchy, but I would say it's generational. The fillers are always there, but the types of fillers being used change with the generations. And, what you're referring to, it became very famous as the Valley Girl, the kind of California dialect, which used a tremendous amount of fillers in young people's communication.
We consciously added it to our speech. In fact, as teenagers, I remember forcing myself to sound that way. Almost the way today the girls tend to go up and ask a question even when they're affirming something. There was a
Oh
real...
yes, and I know many adults who do that as well. You know that it's like I'm not thrilled about this term meme or the idea of viruses and of ideas, but it is sort of like that. It becomes infectious, and people start to adopt those forms of paralanguage. And there's not much we can do about it, I don't think. I mean, I think language generally changes. The vocabulary changes. The kind of informal grammar or usage changes. Slang words come up. Other words fall out of use. And I think the same is true for various forms of paralanguage. So I think it sounds... when you're of a certain age, as I am, the kinds of fillers that younger people use start to sound a little odd and strange and become more noticeable because they're not the ones that we use.
So you don't feel that the English language is going to hell in a handbasket, that it is a natural process?
I don't think so. I think that there are lots of interesting things and unique qualities of the English language that mean that have always made it, or have for a long time made it, very accessible. The grammar of English is in some ways easier to use. We don't have gender. We have a relatively simplistic conjugations compared to other languages, and we love. This is another piece, but we love abbreviations and acronyms. I've always said if we could get things down to a single grunt, as Americans, I'm not speaking for the British because they're different, but as Americans, I think the shorter. The more we can shorten words, the better. And of course, that leaves a lot of room then for fillers to fill in the space.
Now that you have all this extra time.
Yes.
I don't want to take up much more of your time, but I will use the fact that we have you here, this knowledge of communication, to talk with our listeners about the importance of paralanguage, because many of our listeners are professionals, young professionals, retired professionals, and they're very caught up in the right word. And of course, what we're trying to do is encourage the proper use of certain words and grammatical structures. But it is so important, this aspect of paralanguage. Could you just tell them, perhaps even in terms of percentage, how much that matters to communication in general?
Well, I think I always have trouble with putting numbers on things. And I know it sounds so much more legitimate if I could say 75% of your impression, the impression you make on other people, will be based on your paralanguage. But, to be honest about it, let's not put numbers on it. Let's just say that it's extraordinarily important. And it takes time. It takes work to get comfortable with speaking well. But it makes such a big difference. It's such a big difference. Even when so many of us are accustomed to fillers and other kinds of affectations in speech, when you can speak well, you can be the dumbest person on earth, but if you can speak well, people will think that you're brilliant. For Americans, this also goes along with if you have an English accent, you automatically get tremendous credit that you don't deserve. And not Cockney, of course, but the King's English or Queen's English. But for speakers generally, the ability to speak well will give you tremendous advantages in every walk of life. So I think that's something that really needs to be emphasized much more than people think about it, much more than it is at present. And I'd also say that despite the fact that we've de-emphasized public speaking to such a large extent, much of certainly white-collar work will require you to get up in front of people and give a presentation.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the worst things that's happened is PowerPoint, because people then focus on making a snazzy visual presentation and completely overlook the fact that the main part, the heart of the presentation, is getting up and speaking. Mm-hmm. And so the ability to speak well, it has to do, of course, with your vocabulary, with having proper grammar, not because proper grammar is some ultimate good in itself, but because when you use non-standard grammar, people notice that. Mm-hmm. And you want your language to be transparent. You don't want people to say, why is he talking that way? Why is he using those strange, or this unusual choice of words, mm-hmm. or, just making people, feel uncomfortable in some way.
So that you're speaking a language that's universal enough and clear enough, because you want people to focus on what you're saying rather than on how you're saying it. It's almost like lighting design. We often say in the theater that if you notice the lighting design for a play, then the guy really didn't do well, because you're supposed to be watching the play, not the lights.
Exactly. And if you want them to notice anything at all, it's how lovely it is. Mm-hmm. How you want them to come away with a just this very positive expression. So, and another element of that is making sure you know how to pronounce words properly. And this is something that comes up a lot. And in some ways we have this experience of reading words and not necessarily hearing them pronounced, mm-hmm. and picking, sort of assuming incorrect pronunciations. So that's important as well. And it's actually so easy to check now, because you can go on the internet, mm-hmm. and it's very easy to just look up a word and you can find very high up on Google places where they give you the option to hear the word pronounced. Mm-hmm. So I think all of that is important, because, ultimately people judge us. No matter what we do, people judge us. And actually, kind of the lesson number one in communication is that no matter what you do or don't do, you're communicating. Mm-hmm. You're giving off an impression by the way you look and the way you sound, and any action you take and any action you don't take. So the way you sound, as one component of that, will say something about who you are, about the kind of person you are. And I think we all want to make a good impression. We all want people to think well of us. And so that means paying attention to the sound of your voice. And by the way, there's nothing more intrinsic to our identity. There's nothing more important to who we are than the sound of our voice. Oh. If you think about it, you see yourself occasionally. Once in a while you look in the mirror. Mm. But your voice is with you all the time.
Mm. Oh, that's a lovely idea. I like that very much. Well, our listeners, as shall I, will walk away from this with a wonderful experience, because what you said is inspiring, and I hope that a lot of us will take heed to focus on the things that matter in communication. To hear your words, your take on things has been very helpful, and I'm sure our listeners will enjoy this. So thank you for taking the time with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
You too.
Thanks.
Au revoir. Bye.
Au revoir.